Sitting in a hotel room in the United Kingdom, the band members of Metallica took it upon themselves to do what any self-respecting rock band in the 80s would do: trash the place. But they didn't do it to prove just how rock and roll they were. They did it to get their record label back. Despite the relatively strong sales of Ride the Lightning in Europe, the band's UK shows hadn't been selling all that well, and several shows had been cancelled, the tour being cut short. But rather than send the lads home to America, the record label decided it would be cheaper to keep them there than pay for flights and all of the incidentals. Trashing the room was one way to get them back, virtually assuring that the security deposit would be forfeited. With so much free time on their hands, Cliff Burton joined forces with Anthrax's Scott Ian for a day of shopping at Oxford Street. As they waited for a train at Tottenham Court Road station, the pair were approached by two policemen, one of whom asked, "If we were to search you right now, would we find any drugs?" The pair answered no. This answer wasn't taken on face value, and the pair were taken down to the local station for searching and questioning. They did find some pills, and Cliff was quick to inform them that these were just prescription pills for colds and allergies. While they didn't buy this, they sent off the pills to the forensics labs for further investigation. And, as it turned out, they were indeed prescription pills, prompting the police to let Burton and Scott Ian go. The police were quick to apologize and reminded Burton that if it was the United States, the suspects could have expected far worse treatment. Cliff was quick to inform the police that the police know the difference between Quaaludes and cough medicine in the United States, and that they're instead focused on the business of catching real criminals. And when Cliff Burton wasn't being unlawfully arrested for carrying prescription medicine, he was being questioned for some of his less defensible possessions. On the band's way through French customs en route to the UK, a customs officer plucked an item out of Burton's luggage. He looked at it and then quizzically looked at Cliff Burton. "Hey, you never know when you might need it," said Cliff. The item? A hammer.
Huh?
During one of the band's early tours to Sheffield in the United Kingdom, they had been booked to play what appeared to be a school disco, and a young Finnish schoolgirl ended up in the band's tour bus in the front lounge with lighting director Tony Zed. She'd punched Zed in the face, fearing his sexual advances, and then proceeded to tell all of her classmates. This set off a fight, a mass brawl. The whole place was just a big scrap going on. After a while, Cliff Burton decided that he had had enough. "Fetch the hammer!" Burton then proceeded to move through the crowd, whirling his hammer in arcs of 360 degrees, threatening anyone who came close. Audio engineer Mick Hughes, aka Big Mick, remembers the scene as fucking legendary. Despite whatever bad fortune befell the band during their Ride the Lightning tour, they managed to fill not one, but two shows at the famed Marquee in London. The Marquee Club had been graced by the likes of Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, The Who, Pink Floyd, The Police, and Iron Maiden, and Metallica blew the place apart. Lars, speaking to the press at the time, continued to run his mouth about his former bandmate, albeit indirectly. "The Mustaine and McGovney Metallica was pretty one-dimensional. When Hammer and Burton joined the band, they added a lot to our sound." This, despite the fact that to this day, the overwhelming majority of guitar-literate metalheads the world over recognized Dave Mustaine as superior to the man who replaced him in Metallica. With album sales mounting, Megaforce Records had to come good on a clause it had foolishly agreed to in its contract with Metallica, which stated that once sales exceeded 75,000 units, the band could take their business elsewhere, something the label would come to regret. By the end of the year, Metallica's association with Johnny Zazula had come to a less than amicable end, and they were signed to management company Q Prime, a company that had promised Metallica the world. Cliff Bernstein, legendary co-founder of Q Prime, told them as much. saying that they could be the leaders of the new wave of heavy metal. One step further than, say, Iron Maiden, who were at the moment the most extreme metal band with major success. For Metallica, rock god status was suddenly a realizable prospect, and something that would have served to develop even more self-belief was their inaugural performance at the Monsters of Rock Festival at the UK's Castle Donington in 1985. The gig was to be one of the most significant in their then short career. The gig, in front of over 55,000 screaming fans, was packed into a raceway, and it would see Metallica stick out like a sore thumb on a bill that included the likes of Rat, ZZ Top, Marillion, and Bon Jovi. Acknowledging this fact, as Hetfield stepped up to the microphone on this warm summer's day, he addressed the crowd. "If you came here to see spandex, eye makeup, and the words, 'Oh baby' in every song, this ain't the fucking band." The Monsters of Rock Festival was the kind of place where all manner of objects and human excrete was thrown onto the stage. Hetfield addressed the audience and said if they planned to throw things on stage, just to make sure that they didn't hit the band's beer. At this particular Monsters of Rock, the component parts of an entire pig made their way to the stage, as well as the standard issue water bottles full of human urine. Metallica loved it, and it would become their spiritual home for years to come. Following their European tour of 1985, the band went back into the studio to record what many, to this day, consider their magnum opus, and perhaps one of the greatest heavy metal albums of all time. Master of Puppets was released in February of 1986. Over 300,000 copies were sold within 3 weeks of release. Over 500,000 copies before the end of the year. All of this with no radio airplay and no videos. Neil Perry from the UK's Sounds magazine hailed it as a landmark in the history of not just heavy metal, but recorded music. The now veteran rock journalist Mick wrote that the band had finally grown up and stood taller than ever before. It's their finest LP to date, he wrote, finer than any of their so-called contemporaries are likely to record this year. This wasn't entirely true, with Slayer's Rain in Blood album also released in 1986. But the use of the term so-called contemporaries would no doubt have stung Dave Mustaine, whose debut album at that stage was barely worth a notable mention. But despite the compliment, Lars Ulrich wasn't a massive fan of the term thrash metal. "I don't really like that term. It implies lack of arrangement, lack of ability, lack of songwriting, lack of any form of intelligence. There's a lot more to our songs than just thrashing." Master of Puppets went on to gatecrash the Billboard 200 at number 29. No small feat for a thrash metal band, and this feat would pave the way for others like Pantera, Amon Amarth, and Lamb of God to do the same many years later. Back on tour in support of their biggest album to date, Metallica joined forces with the Prince of Darkness himself, Ozzy Osbourne, for a full-blown US tour. While on tour, some disturbing news made its way to the band. It turned out that some teenager had gone on a killing spree after dropping acid. According to one witness, he was singing the lyrics of Metallica's song, No Remorse, as he took the lives of unsuspecting victims. The perpetrator was sentenced to death, and as he stood up in the courtroom, he again quoted the lyrics. Not all publicity is good publicity, and this definitely wasn't what the band wanted. Perhaps it was fitting then that they were on tour with Ozzy Osbourne, whose song, Suicide Solution, was blamed for the death of a teenager in 1985. Fortunately for Metallica, they didn't need to appear before a judge to plead their case, like Ozzy did. But the tour with Ozzy Osbourne was to come to a tragic end. On their way from Stockholm to Copenhagen during their European tour, the band drew cards to decide who would get the top bunk. The first card that Cliff picked was the Ace of Spades, and he looked at Hammett and said, "I want your bunk." "Fine, take my bunk," said Hammett. "I'll sleep up front, That's probably better anyway. Several hours later, at 6:30 a.m. on the morning of September 27, while the vehicle was travelling along the E4 in Sweden, the bus's driver lost control of the vehicle, and it was engaged in a skid that lasted for as long as 20 seconds, before the inertia propelled the vehicle from an upright position to one where it was lying on its side in a ditch by the road. The bus's inhabitants managed to navigate their way outside the bus into the morning air of the Swedish countryside, and tour manager Bobby Schneider stayed in the bus until he could be sure that everybody had made their way to safety. Kirk Hammett recalls the incident. "I got thrown out of my bunk and knocked unconscious for like 3 or 4 seconds. When I came to, I heard everybody screaming, but I didn't hear Cliff, and I instantly knew something was wrong." The attention of James, Lars, and Kirk was captured by the shouting of other people who were pointing towards the bus's bottom edge. Like some kind of horror show out of The Wizard of Oz, protruding from beneath the vehicle were Cliff Burton's legs. James Hetfield recalls that all he could see was the bus lying right on top of his former bass player. The bus's driver claimed that there was black ice on the road, forcing him to lose control of the vehicle. But James Hetfield scoured the scene, and he couldn't find any. He recalls walking for miles, looking for this black ice, walking back, walking forwards. "Where's this black ice? I don't see any black ice." James Hetfield wanted to kill the bus driver there and then. Subsequent investigations reveal that there was no black ice on the road indeed, and that the bus driver had probably just fallen asleep at the steering wheel. Despite that, the travel ban against the driver of the bus was lifted just 9 days after the event, and no charges were ever brought against him. In Kerrang! Magazine, a memorial paid for by Johnny Zazula put it best: "The ultimate musician, the ultimate headbanger, the ultimate loss, a friend forever." At the same time, Dave Mustaine received a call from a friend in New York. "It's Cliff. He's dead." "Cliff who?" "Cliff Burton." Dave Mustaine really couldn't muster any response to this. He just stood there, clutching the phone, feeling like he'd been punched in the stomach. Whatever lingering anger or resentment he felt for Lars and James just wasn't there for Cliff. He was just too decent a person, according to Dave. For whatever reason, guilt, anger, sadness, Mustaine was suddenly inspired to go out and score some heroin. And in this shifted physiological state, he wrote an entire song, "In My Darkest Hour." The song wound up on Megadeth's next album, and it was inspired not only by his rocky relationship with his girlfriend Diana, but also the pain he felt upon hearing of the death of Cliff Burton. But the show had to go on, and with Metallica's world being turned upside down, Megadeth were readying for the release of their sophomore album. Despite being half-baked throughout the recording process, Megadeth released Peace Sells, But Who's Buying in November of 1986, just 2 months after Burton's passing. The album represented a sonic leap forward, both musically and lyrically, with political undertones that would go on to be synonymous with Megadeth's lyrics for most of the band's career. "If there's a new way, oh, I'll be the first in line, but it better work this time." Not only was the music better, but the artwork too was true to Mustaine's comic book-inspired vision. Off the back of the critical and commercial response to this album and the band's blistering live performances, the band's contract with Combat was promptly sold to one of the biggest major labels on the planet, Capitol Records. Capitol Records, of course, represented a big step up for the band, and an opportunity to schmooze with LA's big shot record label execs and do coke in the bathroom of the Capitol Records Tower in LA. The step up was also reflected in the parties that the label would throw. Capitol Records threw one such party for the release of Peace Sells, But Who's Buying. The band were given 2 limousines for the purposes of the event. And at the end of the night, as they piled into the limo outside, Dave Mustaine asked, "Hey, where's the other limo?" To which Chris Poland replied, "Lana took it." That was all Dave Mustaine needed, and Chris Poland, not one to back down from a fight, told him to fuck off. Just like that, punches were being exchanged in the back of the limo until the driver said, "You want to fight? Then get the hell out of my car." Hostilities instantly ceased, just like that. Just another day in Megadeth. The Peace Sells album sold tens of thousands of units and would eventually be certified platinum. While it would by no means be looked back on as the band's best work, it announced Megadeth's arrival as a force to be reckoned with. In the next episode, Metallica picks up the pieces, and Megadeth says, "So what?" If you enjoyed this episode of Battle of the Bands, I'd love it if you showed your appreciation by subscribing, leaving a review, or telling a friend who you think might also enjoy it. It's the support of people like you that ensures I can continue to bring you episodes just like this one, absolutely free. Until next time, house lights,